So, okay, uh, there've been some new news from the Middle East as there's been a Trump's plan for a peace deal between Gaza and Israel. Do we know something about
Uh, yeah, so as things stand now, the both sides are currently in this 72-hour period which they have been given to release hostages. Hamas have 48 remaining hostages. Israel will be releasing around 2,000 Palestinian prisoners. Um, if that process goes ahead successfully, the terms of the agreement then stipulate that the IDF will begin its withdrawal from Gaza. It will be, I think, 3 stages in terms of how far back their defensive line will go until they are outside of the Gaza Strip. And in return, Hamas have agreed to demilitarize, to dismantle their weaponry system, and to exclude themselves from future governance of Gaza. That's the agreement that's been negotiated by the Trump administration and agreed to, at least for now, from both sides. Um, Whether it lasts, I'm not sure. What do you think? Do you think it will hold out?
it? I mean, firstly, I think it's quite interesting that Israel agreed to it because overall it's undeniable that they were winning this war, but yet they agreed to some ceasefire which doesn't really benefit some politicians, like from the right wing, quite like anti-Palestinian parties, you
Mm.
know, and then they agreeing to it. And as a lot of media from Israel reported, that it was a defeat, a complete defeat, a capitulation of Israel, and it quite, to be honest, might seem so for some people, you know. But when it comes to how likely it is to hold, I mean, I think at least with the current administration, there's some guarantee that still, for as long as the current American administration stays in power, probably it will just remain as it is. But then it will get, the more time goes, I feel like this ceasefire will be less and less stable overall, because as you can see, probably Trump, I don't know, he's doing it to gain some points in his internal politics or something, as American politics these days tend to have this balance between dividing what is internal, what is external, and combining into like one big agenda, you know? So,
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Israel was kind of put in a position where it doesn't really have any choice but to agree to it because they've stated the entire time that their goal was to dismantle Hamas, to stop what they call the terrorist state, Hamas-run entity on their borders. One of the stipulations of this deal is that Hamas will basically disappear. So if
I mean, I
they,
think just to quickly say, I think it's just a problem with nowadays politics. Whenever some, I don't know, military operation starts and politicians try to put some big goal on what is their, I don't know, what they want to achieve throughout this operation or war period, usually fails as they set some very ambitious goals.
yeah,
Like
I'm not
here,
saying,
dismantling like a terrorist organizations, very difficult. Like if you look at ISIS, for instance, like it still
yeah,
exists.
but ISIS were never willing to negotiate with the United States. Hamas were and willing to negotiate with Israel, for example, or Al Qaeda were not ones who were going to negotiate. Hamas are slightly different. They are not just a terrorist organization; they're also a political governance entity who
I mean, I never
want
said
the.
I think they are a
No, no, I'm not.
conventional
I'm not.
terrorist organization,
I'm not
to be
suggesting you
honest.
were. I'm just saying that that yeah. Apologies. I
It's
think
okay.
Israel had differently intended goals. than just dismantling Hamas or removing Hamas from power. I think it's
I mean, there were
fairly
different goals, I
not
feel like.
everyone in Israel, but I think the initial, or at least what became the goals of the Israeli government or certain people within the Israeli government after a long time was to ensure that a Palestinian state never happened. But I think more than anything, Israel lost the PR battle on this
Yeah, but I
fully
mean, I'm
across
not
the world.
sure about if they
But
completely lost because, like,
no,
as as I said, the Israelis some news are saying that, but on the other hand, we don't know. I mean, I personally am not sure where will they stay? Will they still stay in some Gaza territories and for how long? Because right now there is a
I mean,
step one where they retreat from some territory, but will be there step two where they
yeah,
will keep the agreement,
yeah,
you know?
there
So
is.
it's not necessarily like a total defeat, but it seems like they could have gained more than they're gaining right now.
No,
Because in the end
I
of
don't
the
think
day,
it's a
they gained overall.
yeah, yeah, but I don't think it's a defeat for them at all, because they have ensured that Hamas have no power going forward, right? They're ensuring that this organization, which they wanted to destroy, they've not destroyed it. I don't think it's possible to destroy it, but they've ensured that their power is significantly decreased. And over the past 2 years, they've done that with Hezbollah as well. So overall, you cannot say it's been unsuccessful for them. They've destroyed and dismantled the two, what they posed as the two biggest threats to their security, which was Hezbollah and Hamas. But I think they have put themselves into a position where, maybe if a year ago they could have achieved more, but they had firmly lost the PR battle on this in a way that if you were to ask, I mean, I've seen polling about this in the UK and the US, the overwhelming majority of people will respond to a question: Has Israel gone too far? Is Israel committing war crimes? Is Israel committing genocide? The overwhelming majority of people will poll against Israel. We've seen now the UN has officially designated that they have committed a genocide. There's been a recognition of Palestine and a condemnation of Israel from almost every major Western state now, except the United States and Germany. Israel's relations with the entirety of Europe, with probably just about every country in the world, bar a few, are now significantly worse than they were 2 years ago. So Israel was in a position
I
where
mean, I just wanted to
I
say
think,
quickly, can I, that I think there's two things we need to distinguish, which are firstly the population approval of Israel actions, and then the governmental approval, because usually the governors tend to respond to population in the West,
mhm.
but it does not necessarily mean that they will completely cut ties with Israel or with
No,
any entity which the population doesn't agree with. It's like, you
no,
could take,
obviously
for instance,
not.
because if this logic would apply everywhere, then Macron would have to resign because majority of French people want him to resign and call for elections. But it's not happening, and I
No,
think here it
obviously,
applies as well.
obviously not. Obviously not. But I think both of these things go hand in hand. That because Israel lost this PR battle, in which the majority of the public in the West has turned from having any kind of sympathy to having complete condemnation, that Western governments, barring the United States basically, and Germany, but I don't think they're far behind. And I think that obviously there's a historical context there, but almost every other Western government, UK, France, Canada, Australia, Italy, have all now condemned Israel and began recognizing Palestine. I don't think because of some moral thing that they're like, oh, Israel's so bad, because they can see that their public think that. They can see that their public now are disgusted with the actions of Israel and are very unhappy that their government has not been stronger on this issue because Israel firmly lost the PR battle. If you look at the PR battle in Europe, in terms of the Russia-Ukraine war, it has to be said Ukraine has won that so far. That the majority of European public are in favour of supporting Ukraine. But that cannot be said about Israel, even though Israel, like Ukraine, before this war, was the firm European and Western ally. You, obviously there's different reasons for that. We're not going to go into those, but it's just an interesting point of how Israel's biggest mistake and the reason they've been put in this position was because they were unable to keep the Western public on their side, even though they had a huge amount of sympathy. If you go back 2 years ago, we're only 3 days after the 2 year anniversary of what happened on October the 7th when Hamas carried out those attacks. There was a huge amount of sympathy for Israel. Now that's all gone, like completely.
I mean, I think here's a place a bit of this thing where, especially with Israel, where we live right now in a culture, I think, where the weak will usually be more in favor by the public than the strong one. Because even if though October the 7th happened, a lot of people were already not very in favor of Israel responding in the beginning. Just it started growing and growing and growing with the more atrocities, of course, that they've been committing in Gaza. But I think it also comes from the standpoint that Israel is just a more developed country and they have more means to defend themselves. And if something like this was, the question would be, what would happen if something like that could potentially happen in Israel? Like some big, I don't know, Hamas was able to go through the Iron Dome, or Iran was targeting civilian sites because they were clearly really not targeting the civilian sites as much as Israel does in Gaza, as an example. And if
No.
something like that would happen in any city in Israel, how would the public respond? Because I don't really think that even if Iran would do something like that, that necessarily public would be all of a sudden back with Israel. So I think it's more
No, I don't
about
think. I think they've
all of
lost it.
this. But I think it's not necessarily that they lost it because they did something, but also just because they're stronger. That they're a stronger power, they have more means to defend themselves, they have a stronger military, and just people tend to support someone who is weaker rather than someone who is stronger. It's not necessarily about who is true, who is right to do something, who is wrong, but more about this balance in power. But
But
since
then
we live,
if that were the case, then the public would not have supported NATO interventions in the Balkans because NATO was
but
much
it was a
stronger than
different time.
Serbia.
It was
But
a different moment. It
so you
was a
think it's
moment
just
of
that?
US dominance in the world, and right now we live in more multipolar world. So,
Yeah. No, I
as
understand your point. Um,
because like you've
yeah.
been talking a lot about Western reaction, at the same time there is the Middle East where it's happening, and it seems like Middle East for the 21st century became just a battleground for operations from different countries
Yeah.
to an intervention, and
Mhm.
even within the region, like Israel is doing overall. In Lebanon, what happened? In
Mhm.
Iran, if we take it as a part of Middle East, because sometimes people don't. But how
Yeah.
long do you think, like, how long do you think we will be observing this? That some great powers are just playing around in Middle East with their weapons and
But
have it as a,
that's
I don't
not a
know, like
new
a
thing.
weapon testing site.
That's not a new thing. That the major powers have been playing around in the Middle East for centuries. It was,
Yeah, but
first
what
the
changed
Ottoman
is that they are
Empire, then
emerging. They are
when the Ottoman
emerging.
Empire,
Middle East overall
what is
is emerging.
emerging?
Middle Eastern
Certain
powers like
parts of it are.
Saudi Arabia, Iran overall, still it lost a lot of
Iran is
influence.
not emerging. Their economy is been stagnating for years. They're under crippling sanctions. You know,
Yeah, but you
when it
only
really
take,
came to it, no, but
if
okay,
you
but
only take
I'm
economical part, then of course, but I'm talking overall about the
no
influence of a country.
Iran now. Iran now, their influence is exponentially weaker than it was 2 years ago because all of their proxies have been destroyed and dismantled. Hezbollah basically no longer exists. Hamas, as of now, basically no longer exist. Their only ally in government in another state was Bashar al-Assad. He's now, playing video games in Moscow or whatever the recent report was. The Houthis seem to have less power and influence now than they did even 6 months to a year ago. Iran has lost all of their influence in the Middle East. They had this network and they were spreading their influence across the Middle East. That has been completely dismantled. That's the only thing that I would say Israel has been fully successful in achieving their goals has been to weaken Iran.
I mean, I think overall with Israel and in the region especially, what happened is they lost a lot of soft power overall. But when we look
Yeah,
at the other Middle Eastern countries, like and actions that been taken later, like in bombings in Qatar and
yeah.
Iran losing its site of influence, wouldn't it necessarily just promote this emerging power, some, I don't know, NATO-like alliance possibly, of, I don't know, Persian Gulf at least, or if you take a bigger scope, some Sunni countries in the region just
Yeah,
coming
it could
together.
happen. It could happen. Um, I mean, these countries tend to not have a history of getting on very well with each other. I could see an Arab alliance happening. I don't think a Sunni Muslim alliance. I don't see, Turkey joining some alliance with Saudi Arabia and, you know, Iran joining some alliance with them as well. I know they're a Shia country, obviously, but I don't see some greater Muslim alliance happening or Islamic alliance. So I don't see Pakistan joining anything like this. But an Arab alliance, possibly. I mean, there
But
already
if
is
we're talking about
the
even
Arab
Arab alliance, it just
Arab
means that there
Union.
is a opening for a possibility of Middle East becoming just more neutral rather than pro-West or kind of pro-China or pro anyone. They could be just pro themselves, which could be a potential threat for Israel in the end, and no, and
Yeah,
US influence especially.
I mean, you know, you claimed Israel has lost its soft power. It absolutely has. It basically has one. You know, okay. It still has alliances. It still has trade networks with lots of other countries, but its alliances with most countries have really weakened. If we look at even in Trump's first term, the Abraham Accords were emerging, in which Israel is normalizing relations with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia. They were starting trade deals with with both those countries and other countries in the Gulf as well. But that's kind of ending now. There's a huge distrust, particularly from Qatar, obviously, but the countries around there feel the same way that, if they did that to Qatar, they could do that to us. Israel's relationships with the European Union, with most European countries, have been significantly damaged. The only country that their relationship seems to have improved with is the United States, and that's only because Donald Trump and the Trump administration are huge supporters of Israel. Um, just about every other country they've weakened their alliances with, and there's a possibility that when all this calms down, if it does, if Israel withdraws and all that, they're left in a position where they've they're completely reliant on the US for everything because other countries are not wanting to trade with them anymore. They're not wanting to
But I
to be
mean,
involved with Israel in any way.
overall, I don't think Israel loses that much because they're not like some, I don't know, superpower. I mean, unless you are some conspiracy theorists,
Yeah,
but I think overall, if you look at the US, they are the one who are losing a lot because they changed their tactics and strategy overall to this selective engagement where they will just choose what conflict to support, even if it's a conflict between their de jure allies. Like if you take the case of Qatar and Israel, where the military bases in Qatar didn't
yeah,
do basically anything, and yet they chose to support Israel. Doesn't mean that there is some hierarchy of allies for the US. But then the question
yeah.
arises
Of
for the
course,
rest of the allies is whether where are they in this hierarchy? Are
in the
they
hierarchy.
in the
Yeah,
bottom list or top list? And I
yeah.
think overall
I
just
mean,
leads to the uh, loss of this power that US had
yeah.
in the beginning of the
But I mean,
century.
the perfect example of that is I think Canada, who if you'd have asked anyone even 2 years ago, who is the US's closest ally, who there's very little chance of them having any kind of breakdown in relations with, you would probably say Canada. And
Yeah.
yet, in the last year, we've seen a serious diplomatic breakdown. We've seen the President of the United States threaten to annex Canada. We've seen their trade reach record lows, even though Canada was before, I think maybe still is, I don't know, but it certainly was the biggest trading partner of the United States. Um, but it's all part of this really strange foreign policy of the Trump administration.
But when
We
you're saying Trump
started.
administration, I just wanted to quickly add, isn't it
Okay.
probably where is this arriving from? Like some person gets elected and all of a sudden the strategy and the tactics and relationship of countries change because it's quite what you're suggesting, at least when you're saying the Trump
Well,
administration came and damaged the relation in Canada, is suggesting that democratically elected president is not a good thing, as if basically someone I know in Beijing would think, okay, we don't have that. We have elections with one candidate, and then our relationship with countries don't change one night because we have more long-term strategy probably, while in the U.S. just this government structure maybe is not that well. Or what are you suggesting?
no, I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with a democratically elected president. But what the United States does have, which I don't believe any other countries have, is that when a president from a new party is re-elected, it's not just him and the cabinet members who change in Washington, it's almost every senior civil servant. Every single ambassador is recalled and new ones are appointed. And if you take the State Department, for example, which handles all US foreign policy, all the top people in that are changed. That's what's always happened for some reason. They don't have a professional, neutral, bipartisan civil service or diplomatic service like the UK or like most countries. They have party political appointees who are brought in. So yeah, the system in the United States does having the change of government every so often, every 4 years, does completely change the entire foreign policy strategy now, at least because an entire new team of diplomats is brought in. We never saw these dramatic changes before because the two parties were broadly in alignment on foreign policy from the end of um, the Second World War until 2016. But now that we've seen the two parties veer very far apart in their foreign policy beliefs, we're going to see this, that every time a US administration changes, there's going to be a huge shift in their foreign policy direction.
Yeah,
The
but what
only
you're suggesting, it sounds like some semi-technocratic regime, basically, where there will be some class of bureaucrats which will not be elected, but instead be appointed and then what, stay there till the age of retirement or what? And who will be the one who will be appointing them? That's the question. And at the same time, if, for instance, let's say Trump all of a sudden will change the system into what you're suggesting, I don't think it will be accepted by the Democrats that he will just appoint some,
no, it won't be.
I don't know,
It won't
diplomats
be.
and then make a law saying that you can't change that, and
I'm not
some other
suggesting
body will be changing it. But
I'm
that's
not
what it
suggesting it
sounds
should
like.
be
You want some
changed.
bureaucrats that will be basically like what, selected bureaucrats, not like elected
Well,
like it
that's
is right
that
now.
is what happened. That is what happens in most countries in the world. If you look at the UK or Russia or Germany or France or Japan or anyone, there is elected politicians who oversee these departments, but these departments are full of non-elected bureaucrats who are people that have worked their way up, who are experts in those fields, who understand the inner workings of the government mechanics because they've been there for decades, many of them, and that they make decisions on a smaller scale, but they react and respond to the overarching kind of broad directional policy platform of the elected politicians. But these people run day-to-day government departments, and they do that in a non-political way. They just take the direction from politicians and implement that as best as to the best of their ability. But in the United States, it's different. It's a
Yeah,
different
but
system. I
the
don't know.
problem
It's a
is
better system, but
you're suggesting European format of politics, yet European politics are also in a crisis, and not necessarily it's US who is dragging them into it, but themselves, like Macron or Olaf Scholz or Keir Starmer are being unpopular not because of Trump being in power necessarily. It's a trend,
I'm
or
not
US,
suggesting
I know
that.
US diplomat changing, you know,
I'm
it's
not
not
suggesting
necessarily
that for a
about that.
second.
So like I don't know, you're suggesting US taking some like I don't know, you're saying that US, if they would have this selected bureaucracy like in Europe, all of a sudden they would be doing better. Yet in Europe it
No,
doesn't
I'm not
work that
suggesting that.
well
My,
either.
I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that they would have a more coherent, understandable, structured foreign policy platform than what they have right now. I mean, Trump's entire foreign policy platform before the election was isolationism. We're going to withdraw from all foreign wars. We're not going to be intervening anywhere. And we've now seen he's launched attacks in Yemen, attacks in Iran, attacks in Venezuela. I
I
read
mean,
today he's going to be
Yemen is a
launching
bit
strikes in Haiti.
controversial. Yemen is a bit controversial because it's been happening before, you know.
No, it doesn't. I know, but he said he was going to end all these foreign wars. He's not ended any. I mean, he might have ended other people's wars, but he's certainly not ended any of these conflicts that the United States is involved in. They've been bombing Iran, they've been bombing Yemen, they've been bombing Venezuela now. They're potentially going to be bombing Haiti
I mean,
soon.
they haven't been bombing
This
Venezuela, let's
okay, they've been
be
bombing
honest.
Venezuelan ships.
That's
They've
yeah.
been bombing Venezuelan ships. So this idea that he put out there, which I think was a very popular idea, and one of the reasons he did get elected was because he said we're going to focus on the US, America first. You know, it's an era of US isolationism, an era where the US isn't intervening in foreign conflicts. But that has not happened at all. It's been the complete opposite.
I mean, I think it's just overall, you in US, even Trump is not almighty, and there are also
No, but
interest
he's been
groups
making
within
these
the US.
decisions.
Yeah, but there are interest
Okay,
groups within the
what's
US. It's not that Trump just got elected and all of a sudden he spawned the isolationist movement with him, Like he just showed up and said, okay, I'm giving you 1 billion now. I don't know, this amount of people will be supporting America First movement. It's just about this shift in the ideological interest groups, where before it was this globalist groups with, I don't know, like this conventional Republicans who supported intervention into Iraq, in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, invasion of Afghanistan, Lebanon bombings, and basically demolishing some regimes and governments in other countries. But now it seems like there are more these nationalist movements and isolationism. Maybe
but
it
it's
just
not
comes from this,
isolationist.
but I think it's just on one hand, it comes from this perspective that overall, if we look at the US, they've been declining as a global dominant power in terms of production. Like, China right now basically makes every fifth car in the world. And it's not necessarily
Yeah.
the cars that just will be used in China, just they're being sold to abroad. If we
Yeah,
look at
okay, but
the trade balance between US and China is the one who has a surplus of it, and US just has a deficit for how many decades. And it
yeah,
comes from
I'm
it
not
overall. It's
disputing
just
that.
what it leads to is
But
like it leads to the problem that there is a decline in US in terms of manufacturing in comparison to the world, and they're not able to be this global hegemon anymore, where there
that's
are
not a
other
new
countries.
trend, though. That's not something that's happened within the last 5 years.
Yeah,
Manufacturing's been declining in the US for probably 30, 40 years.
but what is new is innovation decline as well.
Is there, though, when they're the world's leading AI country, the world's leading social media company, the
Yeah,
world's
but how
leading
come
technology
China?
company? You know, if you look at the top 10 biggest companies in the world, I think nine of them are from the US and they're all tech companies.
Yeah,
There's not a
but
lack of innovation in the US.
on the other hand, uh, could you imagine 2 years ago, or even 1 year ago, in the beginning of the last year, that all of a sudden one day there will be DeepSeek, who will be competing with ChatGPT, and then a lot of news media would have to explain why ChatGPT is still better. You know,
No,
it
but
just happened
okay,
one day,
to
and
come
it's
back
just
to a point
what?
to come back to a point you made a few minutes ago, because I didn't get a chance to respond. You were making a point about how, the powerful interest groups in America have changed. You had these previously these
I not changed. I
interventionist
never said changed. I have shifted. Let's be
shifted.
fair.
Okay, well, these interventionist Republicans who are in favor of regime change have drifted out, and now you have these, the MAGA crowd, the isolationists. But you know, they're still in favor of regime change. They've spoken openly about wanting regime change in Iran, wanting regime change in Venezuela. They're just picking different countries. Their foreign
Yeah, but
policy,
I'm
they
not
like
talking
to
about the
pretend.
officials.
No, but
Right now, you're talking about the officials. I'm talking about the interest groups. It's not necessarily the people who are actually in power. It's population. If you look at, there are a lot of MAGA or Republican voters who've been promoting Trump a lot during these elections, and now all of a sudden they're not that much in favor of helping Israel as they used to before, and now all of
yeah,
a
because they
sudden
were
they're being
lied to.
critical. But these are the interest groups I'm talking about.
Yeah, because they were lied to, because they were promised by the Trump campaign that they would be entering an era of total isolationism and withdrawal from foreign conflict, and that's not happened at all.
Yeah, it's
Because they
it's
were
happening
lied
in
to.
trade through trade wars. That's the overall this decline of globalization of trade, where you buy, I know, some details in Taiwan and then assemble them in India or China, and then people in
Yeah,
US buy them and use them as a computer or a car.
but
That's been declining
look,
since
yeah,
COVID.
it has been. It has been. Um, However, I I think Trump's or the Trump administration's blanket tariff policies don't make much strategic or economic sense. That if you're putting targeted sanctions on specific goods, I completely understand that. I might not necessarily be in favor of it, but I can understand the sense in doing that. If you're putting goods on cars, tariffs on cars, or tariffs on steel, or tariffs on things that actually there is a potential manufacturing base in the US for. But you're just putting tariffs on everything, and you're putting huge tariffs on countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, which is where the majority of clothes produced in are produced for the United States market. The United States is not going to suddenly start manufacturing lots of clothes, right?
Yeah, but
Because
they're in a
there's no way it would
dangerous
ever be profitable or affordable.
they're in a dangerous dependency overall on China, because what is happening that
Yeah,
the
but
officials in
why does
US
that make
officials
sense to be
can
putting
I
tariffs
finish?
on
Can
Vietnam and
I finish?
Bangladesh?
Can I finish? Officials in the US are basically telling the public for some specific reasons that China is a big threat for US dominance and the evil communists and etc., all of this propaganda. And what is happening? You're producing all of these things and manufacturing them in countries in the region where China is. Like what is it?
Straight.
Malacca stray, which could be potentially a hot spot in some conflict if it would happen between China and US. And then there is Bangladesh, then there is India, who might not be neutral, and you put in
But I feel
danger your production. And overall, if you think from that perspective, putting tariffs and damaging your economy short term could potentially lead to that, but it depends on how it's handled. If it's handled smartly or using ChatGPT to put percentages on
okay,
tariffs.
okay, but let's think about this. Okay, in some hypothetical scenario, if the US and China ever have some hot war, I doubt it's ever going to happen. I could see another Cold War happening, but I don't think it is going to be some hot war, because it doesn't benefit either one of those countries to go to war with each other in any way at all. They would just destroy each other and destroy half the world with them, and neither would probably come out on top really. So, you know, if you're thinking for some strange long-term scenario where that's a potential, then sure, right? But if you're actually looking at genuine day-to-day economics, particularly those which affect ordinary people, why are you putting tariffs on all goods coming out of these countries which manufacture things which are never going to manufacture? Like, okay, answer me this honestly. Is there ever going to be a huge clothing manufacturing base in America? No, because it would
Potentially.
not be profitable. It
I
wouldn't be
answered,
profitable.
but I
Okay,
answered.
but it's not. Yeah, you did, but it wouldn't be profitable because one, I don't think they grow enough of the raw materials anymore. I don't think they're going to start doing that. And two, they don't have the workforce to do that are able to be paid such a low amount to make it profitable. It's just not possible. And also, do you think there's a large amount of Americans that want to go and work in clothing factories? I don't think so. These are
Yeah,
low
but
skilled, low
who was
paid
the largest?
jobs.
Can I ask you a question? Who was the largest buyer of American produced soy beans in the world? What country?
I have no idea.
It was China before the tariffs. And how come you're saying they won't be able to produce something more sophisticated to goods as clothes, but yet they are producing soybeans and sell it to China? How is it happening? Why it's profitable? Why US is making some beans
Because
while China is not able to supply themselves with enough of this quite basic,
okay,
basically food
I don't know exactly. Maybe the
goods.
US is one of the only countries where soybeans can be readily grown. I don't know. I don't know anything about agriculture, right? There's obviously a reason for that. Also, farming is largely industrial at this point. There's not many actual jobs in farming anymore. The one huge farm could be run by like a handful of people. Um, Clothing, I believe to be different. Clothing tends to be made in these very low paid labor intensive factories, grown in cotton fields, which are usually very labor intensive as well. You know, if anything, this is only going to make clothing more expensive in the United States, right? You can't suddenly, there's not, the United States doesn't have a huge unemployment rate either, right? You can't suddenly bring every single manufacturing possibility back to the United States all at once, right? It's just not possible. Pick certain things that you think your country can be good at, cars, steel, whatever. Pick certain things. Don't try and bring everything back to the United States. There's not enough workers. Also, you're kicking out all the illegal immigrants who have made up a large part of your workforce. So you're going to have even less people to work in these jobs, right? You're just you can't do all of these things at once. It's just not possible. They don't work. They don't coincide with each other. If you were to put targeted sanctions on countries that actually rival you, you know, stealing cars from China or cars from China, steal from India, you know, cars from the EU, sure, that makes sense.
And let
On
me
every
comment on the
country, you know,
previous point. You're already going somewhere further. You said that there are not a lot of people to be these blue collar workers, but at the same time, you're not talking about the statistic which exists in many developed countries, Russia, UK, Germany. There are not that many exceptions. Finland, even, that there are a lot of people who get a degree in some high education, but they don't end up working in the specialization they study for. And then there is a problem of maybe this misbalance of people wanting to do something and then the realistic situation of the market. And what you're saying that there, how many people would want to, I don't know, be farmers, work at the factories and stuff like that. But it's about these values that are set up in a culture, you know, and like what maybe the farmers are like what 1-2% of the workforce, but if we take services for instance, would be probably like 10, if not more, like the biggest probably sector. Why wouldn't you try to maybe automate it as well and then be able to relocate new generations, which will be probably established with different values by the government institutions, which are schools, to normalize being a white blue collar worker.
yeah. But I said, I don't know if you missed my point. I've made it several times. I said, do that for cars, do that for steel, do that for computer
Why not for
chips, right?
clothing?
Do that. Okay, because one, it's not in a. I mean, it's an essential good, right? But it's not a huge driving force in your economy. It's not going to be the backbone of your economy. No one wants those jobs, right? No one wants to be working in clothing factories. I don't think it's has any potential to be profitable. You're not going to be able to export it to anyone because they're going to be able to buy far cheaper in these countries. You know, you, like, we're not talking about high-end luxury clothing because America doesn't really produce high-end luxury clothing. There's a couple of companies, obviously, but it's much bigger industry in France and Italy. We're talking about cheap clothing. We're talking about Nike, Adidas, right? You suddenly start manufacturing these things in the United States, they're going to have to be more expensive. There's no doubt about that, at least short term. People are just going to stop buying them, right? Uh, People are going to stop buying them. No one's going to want to work in these jobs. It makes no sense, right? Steel, which is crucial to your economy, to your ability to make weaponry to defend yourself. It is crucial for your economic structure and your national security infrastructure. 100%. Chips, which going forward is going to be very, very crucial
I mean, overall,
to
I don't think
your
U.S. politics, I never said that U.S. Tariffs and this economic policy will be able to damage China as they did in the 90s with Japan. Because back then they
no.
had a consensus between European powers and the U.S., basically overall the largest portion of the economy back then, to how to say, make yen so expensive that it would not be competitive with the goods that are
Yeah.
made in US and Europe. But right now, what we have is US trying so hard to push China into some economic decline, but at the same time, European Union or UK especially, who has very close ties with Chinese economy since they've been investing a lot simultaneously into each other. And then there's the European Union with all of this production of cars, and now they're having this conflict of interest because China is able to make cars at much cheaper price than Germany, as an example. I don't
Yeah.
think it will be possible, and I don't know, I never said so, but it felt like you were kind of proving me that it is possible because China is not Japan, it's what, 10 times bigger. And now, if you look
Yeah.
at they have the population problem, of course, but if you look at what are the trends in China, which we are hearing from the news, is them all the time having some competitions on robots, having a lot of drone manufacturing. The largest drone manufacturing in the world for commercial use and now military use is in
Yeah.
China.
But then,
And how
look,
long will it
I
take them with such a, and as I said, the US is losing this dominance on innovation, especially to China, is because do we hear that many companies in US having robot production or robot competitions? We hear none robot competitions or any business fairs presenting some robots like we do in China. And there is not just one Tesla in China who is trying to make a robot, but much more.
I get your point, right? China is not Japan of the 90s. It's much bigger. It's much more economically developed. It's a military power. However, Japan was also the leading center of technological development in the 90s.
Yeah, but back
It,
then
it
you had
was,
a consensus of both largest markets of the world, US and Europe overall, if you exclude the Eastern
yeah,
Bloc,
but the US,
agreeing that
Trump,
they need to do something with Japan, while now it's not really possible that even if European Union and US agrees on something, it doesn't necessarily mean that China will not be able to control their currency and keep it at as
yeah.
low as it
But
is
let me
right
put
now.
this to you, though. Let me put this to you. Trump and the US, had they conducted their foreign policy more smartly, could have done that. But Trump has decided instead that he's going to alienate Europe by putting tariffs on them, which are not necessary. Europe is not selling many goods in America. He's decided to alienate India by putting huge tariffs on them. For I understand India can sell a lot of goods in the US. They manufacture a lot of goods, right? But if you're wanting to compete against China and isolate them economically, India is the 100% the person you need to peel off of them. But instead, the US has decided to try and isolate almost all of its allies. I mean, it doesn't make any economic sense. The US is only willing to make these economic deals with countries that are either not a threat to them at all or not are willing to invest loads and loads of money. Like the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, right? They made a deal with the UK, which is quite favourable, you know, because the UK is not manufacturing anything really significant that's being sold in the US, and I think because Trump has some fascination with the UK because he is half Scottish and he wanted to meet the king. But
I think you're
the
just missing the
US,
point that I don't think necessarily it damaged relationship with Europe as much as you're trying to portray. Why? Because they're just too dependent on US and they can do a lot of things towards Europe that they won't be able to do to India, as India showed that they don't like when Trump says that the economy is dead and putting tariffs on that instead of having some pre-agreed deals and
no,
relationship
but
that they had and keeping them in line. And they can basically how somehow have a political power to respond to it, while in Europe and UK they don't really have the political power when it comes to opposing US, since they are defensive-wise dependent on American industry, military industry, weapons, and protection. When, for
I,
instance, like a Finnish president is coming to US and then making a deal, and then the journalist is asking, "Will you defend us if Russia invades?" And then Trump says, "Yes, yes." You know.
yeah, but I think that Europe would have isolated itself much more from the United States had this happened at a time where Russia and Ukraine were not involved actively in a war. You know, had the Russia-Ukraine war never happened, but Trump still returned to power and implemented these tariffs onto Europe, then I think Europe would have isolated itself from the US much more strongly.
Yeah, but they put themselves in this position by themselves when they basically seem to be European Union seems to be in this situation where they are, at least what how the media portrays, they're not sure whether their largest ally is their friend, and then they have a great threat from the east, and then they have also a lot of problems because Israel is doing genocide, as it was acknowledged by the criminal court in Hague. And then there is also China, who is trying to steal their manufacturing of cars, Germany, UK, and the rest. So I think they put themselves in that position themselves because they were not having quite smart politics for the at least for this century. Because when you rely on someone with defenses, Iran showed when you put all of your anti-air into your proxies in Iraq and Syria, all of a sudden, if they stop working well, you'll be in trouble and won't be able to defend as good against the rockets. And kind of seems like European Union and UK are in the same position when you put all, points into one bucket and then this bucket is taken away by someone. In the case, the bucket is the US, you know?
I agree that there has been too much reliance on American um, defense infrastructure in Europe for far too long, and that needed to change. But I think that Trump threatening to dismantle and destroy the US European relation is a huge mistake strategically for the United States. Who has been the United States' most stable, reliable, valuable allies since World War II? It's been NATO, without a shadow of a doubt. It's not been anyone else.
Yeah,
It's
but
not
at
been
the same
Israel.
time,
It's not been.
as
Uh,
you said, there is some multipolarity in the world happening, then the question is, because I don't think necessarily what you said is true, because what you're talking about is some rigid allies and alliances and partnerships which we're having, but at the same time, some multipolarity leads to uncertainty, and thus it makes partners more, how would you say? You need partners which are more flexible, and the partnership themselves might be more flexible. But okay, we can end for now if you want.
Yes.
Since the birds said we shall end it soon. It's too late on the end. Okay, but thank you for the conversation.
Mhm.